So welcome here to Nazareth Oval in Pennsylvania in the United States. The Enduracers Modern Group have brought out this lovely pair of Alpine cars, the Alpine 110 Cup and the quicker and a little bit more technical, the Alpine 110 GT4, which is pretty much the same chassis but benefits from more performance and a bit more aero. So this car is pretty much the talk of the town at the moment in R Factor 2. It's been included in the official online competition. So I thought it was a good idea to get on board. I'm just looking at the back here. There's some rear diffuser happening here at the back. That's going to become important as we go further. And I'm going to fettle the car with the base setup here at Nazareth. And as we get going, I'll explain why I use this oval and how it's so helpful in generating some initial work for roughing in a base setup. So just when we get out, drive off the ramps here. So as we get out on track to do an initial benchmark lap, I'm going to use the absolute default settings. There's quite a lot of adjustment range within this car, but certain things are not adjustable at all. I'm fascinated by this car because in real life I really like the concept. It's reminiscent in a small way of the Renault Megane mid-engine, the mid-engine endurance car that R Factor 2 offer. So it's mid-engine, 4-cylinder turbo, ultra lightweight in road-going form and in race form. So it's a bit of a giant killer in terms of the cars it can mix it with. This is not an expensive car really in GT4 terms. So we're on defaults and let's look what's happening. We're getting understeer here, which is typical at Nazareth for a stock setup. But if you look at the front right, it's getting very, very warm. I'm going to try and set a decent lap. I'll just downshift once here, get the nose in with a bit of trailing brake, and then open it up. The reason I come to Nazareth to do some initial fettling is it's a very quick way to get a bead on the car's mid-corner performance. It's static state, hard cornering performance. A couple of predictable adjustments happen when we take it to a normal road circuit, because other than this corner here, we don't get any hard fore-aft body weight shifts. We don't get any massive braking zones or any massive acceleration zones. But for mid-corner, it works perfectly, and in a 25-second lap, I can form some conclusions. And so the first conclusion is the car is understeery. We need to get it a little bit more on the nose. That's the first conclusion. It turns in pretty well with a bit of trailing brake. At the moment we get on throttle, it's wanting to eat the front right. So that'll do us as a benchmark lap. Okay, so for the second recording, we're out now. I've jumped ahead of myself in a way because a few days ago I got in this car and I came to Nazareth, but I kind of shortcutted my normal system for fettling a car. Worked on a few things, improved it as much as I could, and went away, and thinking I'd achieved a bit of a base setup, and I hadn't really, because the shortcuts I'd taken had cost me some critical knowledge, and I'm going to explain that when we're back in the setup screen. But these corners, these laps we're doing now, are on that first setup I ended up with. So we're not on the base setup anymore, we're on my first workings. So we should be quicker than base. You can see there the front right is still copping a bit of a hiding. Do one more. See if we can improve. We're going to struggle because we've just, the front right tyre now is no longer within its operating window, so we'll call a halt to that. So if we have a quick little look at those lap times, the real road is static, by the way. I've got a real road level that I generated a long time ago, and I always use that static here at Nazareth. We're not looking at big differences here. The first run on defaults was a 30.141. That second run then on my previous base setup was a 30.033. So didn't really achieve great things. And I've got to admit, I came away from that session not feeling great about this car, not feeling great about its tunability, feeling there was a lot of limits, that it wasn't really going to be able to be rid of the chronic understeer that it suffered. And, you know, somewhat less than appreciative about what the modders had achieved with this car. So this is our third outing now. So I was less than impressed with this car overall, but I watched my friend Michi Hoyer putting in some really good work into this car at Portugal, and coming out of it with a lot of good impressions of the car, and I thought, well, I haven't done it justice. So I came back to Nazareth and I did the job properly this time. And when we get back in the pits, I'm going to show you what I did differently, and we'll have a little bit of a look at how that impacted lap time. You can see the delta above. That's from the lap I did immediately prior on my first attempt, and there's 3/10 straight away, but I think there's more to have. If you have a look at the front right, you'll see it's hot, but it's not as hot as it was. The car's turning enormously better. We've just got, I can feel it through the wheel. I've just got enormous amount more grip. Okay, and that's another point too. So we've taken half a second in lap time on a 30-second lap. So, you know, that's pretty significant. So we'll go back into the pits here at Nazareth, which is a 1.5 mile oval. And we're going to have a little look just for fun. I'm going to drive all the way back in. Something I don't think I've ever done it before. The fire engine here is where we enter. And down here, I've been disqualified for going back into the pit lane. And down here is our little hard stand next to the fire engine. So we'll just have a quick look at those lap times again. Down the bottom here, it was our best lap on defaults, the 30.141. 30.033 was the best lap time I managed to do with my first attempt. And then when I came back and did it properly, I peeled off another half a second. So I got a 1/10 of a second advantage the first time and still had horrendous front right tyre wear. And on my second attempt, I took a further half a second, or 0.6 off the original, just over 0.6 of a second on a 30-second lap off the original lap time for the default setup. So to take us back to the beginning and to show you how I did this properly, I'm going to load defaults again, and we'll start over on the right hand side at drivetrain. And you'll see a few little clues here in blue here as to where we went with our final setup. But what I did was, what I think is really important and what I like to do and what I recommend when you're looking for a default setup is to try to get the car as naked as possible. Any kind of assist, any kind of stabilizing device we want on minimums or off. because we want to see what the car's natural tendencies are from an engineering perspective, what the chassis will do just sitting on the springs without the drivetrain or without any electronic interference whatsoever. Traction control is off. Aero on this car is not available. And of course we come to the biggie, suspension. I'll come back to that in a second. Tyres, I'll just leave them on defaults, which is 145 kPa. Minimums are 140. We'll just leave them on 145 for now, and we'll test the rest of that later. Suspension springs aren't changeable, so when I'll call this zeroing out. We'll zero out all of the dampers. So we're absolutely going to take them down to minimum. Ride height, we will leave standard for now. Anti-roll bars disconnected. I won't play with toe. Rear anti, that's front anti, we've already done that. And zero all these dampers. So the car is just oscillating about on its chassis and on its springs as it would do without any damping or any anti-roll bars. So I went out and set a benchmark lap with all of the settings zeroed, as we called it, and then I started looking at ride height. I wanted to understand the impact of ride height and any asymmetry on ride height. And because the car has a tendency to a lot of understeer, the first thing I wanted to do was drop the nose. So I took the front ride height down to 7 centimeters, went back out. That worked very nicely, took off a chunk of time. And then, whereas in my previous test, trying to get the car on the nose, I raised the rear. That did not work well at all. And having had a little look behind the car earlier, we probably could figure out why, and it was due to diffuser efficiency. The further the diffuser is off the ground, the less efficient the diffuser is. So I also, step by step, I went from 8.5 rear ride height, and I went down to 8, and then down to 7.5, and then down to 7. And yeah, it didn't help with the understeer problem, but the overall grip was fantastic. So having lowered the front to 7, the car was a lot more on the nose. The front end was a lot stronger. Understeer was less pronounced. As I progressively lowered the rear, I was expecting to kind of ruin that, but in fact, any loss of oversteer or any increase in understeer was more than compensated by just a tremendous increase in overall grip. And by this stage, we were down, we were about 0.6 of a second quicker than we were on the zeroed setup. Then I wanted to have a little bit of an understanding of how much of an impact the electronics had. And I added some traction control, and I put traction control onto 1, and I lost 0.2 of a second. And started to get more front wear again. And the reason that happens is that traction control protects the rears and hurts the fronts. I mean, by not letting the rears spin up, you just lose that ability for the rear to kind of rotate, to lose a little bit of lateral traction. And it diminishes the car's ability to rotate. By electronically lowering the power, you can't rotate the car on throttle. And it's also going to protect the rear tyres, logically enough, because they can't spin up, they can't overheat. So that's why adding traction control is bad for the fronts and good for the rear wear, and consequently bad if you're trying to eliminate any understeer. It's not unlike the diff in a way, because by adding, where are we, powertrain, drivetrain, adding traction control has a very, very similar impact in a lot of ways to adding diff preload. Diff preload at this point is still on minimums, and it's very unlikely we'll want to increase that, because what diff preload does is it ties the outer and the inner rear wheel together more by that amount of Newton meters shown, and in doing so it prevents the outer wheel from turning at a different speed. So the more diff preload you've got, the straighter the car wants to go. And that's really the problem we're here trying to solve, is that this car wants to go too straight all the time. It wants to understeer the whole time. Right, the next test I did the classical thing that we often do in R factor 2, was I lowered the tyre pressures down to minimums, and it just felt a little bit mushy. It just felt a little bit unresponsive. And I wasn't convinced it was going better. So I put them back up to defaults, and the steering felt more direct. I just had more steering feel. The car felt more responsive, and I went quicker. There was a difference of, well, it was a 29.821 with them on minimums and a 29.694 with them on default. So it was 1.5 tenths, which is quite a lot on a 30-second lap. So the next thing we did was, remembering all the dampers were zeroed, it was clear that we needed some front-rear asymmetry, but having a car totally undamped is not a clever idea. So you can see the blue numbers here. I went to fours on front slow bump and rear slow bump are probably the first things to talk about. We want the car more on the nose. So slow bump is the one that stops the front springs compressing. So we want that damped less. We want that being allowed to happen. So the fronts are on 4, the rears are on 8. So that's our asymmetry at the moment. It's an asymmetry of 4. 8 compared to 4. 4 at the front and 8 at the rear, did we say? No, 12 at the rear. We ended up with 12 at the rear, pardon me. So we've done quite a lot of asymmetry at the front. Going back to towards the front. So slow rebound we've got on 6, so we're wanting them to compress but wanting a bit of resistance for them uncompressing. I picked the number out of the air for fast bump. The track's pretty smooth, so we just whacked it on 4. Ride height we'd previously brought down to 7. Slow rebound we have on a lower number than slow bump, because we want the rear springs able to uncompress quite readily, so that the weight can get back onto the front axle. And again, we picked that same number out of the hat with fast bump. There wasn't massive damper velocities occurring, and that was that for dampers. Oh yes, looking at my notes here, the first shot we went 4 on the front and 8 on the rear, but then we went back and went to 12 on the rear. And then again, sorry, there were 3 goes. We went, eventually got to 12 on the rear. So all of that was making the car grippier at the front end and faster, because I could turn in better, I could get back on the throttle faster. And then logically and and finally on this lot of settings, we put the rear anti-roll bar on. So stiffening the rear anti-roll bar moves the grip to the front. Okay, so the front of the car is softer and squishier and more compliant, and the rear has less grip. So by adding some rear anti-roll bar, we got more turn in again. And that was the final version 2 of our Nazareth roughing into the setup. The first one I did down here was on the day before, 20th of January. The next one was on the 21st of Jan. I make a few notes in here. I don't write everything down in here, but probably the more you write down, the better. But you can see here at the beginning, I noted that I zeroed the suspension, tested ride height, tyre pressure, traction control, anti-roll bar. I've noted the best solution is minimum ride height, and we've attached the rear anti-roll bar. And that is where we left it. That's where we left Nazareth with that setup as we just discussed. So if we quick look back into suspension, you can see it all there. I'll link this setup below this video, but there's more, because then we went to Spa. So I took that Nazareth base setup out onto the track at Spa, and very predictably it was significantly oversteery. And the reason for that is at Nazareth we're pretty much in a steady state corner situation except for a bit of braking for turn 4. You don't have any of those massive stops that you have, or big acceleration zones that you have on a proper road circuit. So what happens is, under all that longitudinal load, the front axle loads up, you get too much front grip on corner entry and massive oversteer, and then on corner exit we don't have enough rear grip because we've just stiffened the rear too much, softened the front too much. So we get oversteer on entry, oversteer on entry, oversteer on exit. So we deal with the corner entry first, and one of my rules is you deal with the corner entry before you deal with the corner exit, because what you do may fix the exit problem. So we went in and gradually and progressively looked at the front suspension. We increased the slow bump dampers to 7 to just stop that compression onto the front axle happening quite so dramatically at corner entry. We also ended up putting back in the front anti-roll bar to just stiffen up the front, to move the grip rearwards a little bit. And then, wanting more rear grip again, we ended up dropping those rear slow bump dampers. And to maintain some asymmetry here, so we still wanted to have that front anti-roll bar, but we increased the rear anti-roll bar. So those changes made the setup just very, very nice indeed. So lap times at Spa on defaults was a 2 minutes 39.5. With Naz A, it was a 2:38.5, so we found 1 second. But with this final setup that I would now call my base setup for this car, we did a 2:35.578. So we took 4 seconds off the default setup and 3 seconds off what we'd achieved at Nazareth. So just to recap, when you come away from Nazareth, you've got to deal with more longitudinal forces. You're going to end up needing a bit more front damping, front slow bump damping, maybe even stiffer front springs, but we can't do that with this car. But we've done a lot without touching springs. Going back now to electronics, I tried some traction control, and in the dry at Spa, you do not want traction control because the car just pushes. And drivetrain wise, likewise, preload left on absolute minimums. We want this car to be able to rotate. One of the fun things about this car, that there's a limit to what you can achieve in setup, and then you've got to find a way to drive it properly. Okay, this should be fun. So just before I bring to you a video merge of 3 individual laps from myself, I forgot to mention one more thing I did to the setup at Spa. I reduced front camber slightly. Now, if you think back to when we talked about Nazareth and the tendency for that track to produce a setup that's really good with lateral loads but not as good with longitudinal loads, now let's transpose that to the issue of camber. The more camber you've got, the better you are at resisting lateral loads, but the less better you are at resisting longitudinal loads. So long story short is reducing the camber slightly is theoretically going to improve our braking at the front end, but also probably our initial bite, our initial turn in, potentially at the expense of ultimate mid-corner grip. But generally speaking, coming away from Nazareth and coming onto a road circuit, you need to experiment with reduction in camber, particularly front camber. Okay, so this will be a bit of fun. We're sitting on board in the fastest setup, the final setup that we ended up with, and the 2 cars in front are the default setup and the Nazareth base setup, which is going to obviously be a little bit oversteery until we tweak it a little bit. So let's have a look and see if you can guess which is the Nazareth setup. quite fun to watch. Now as we run down to Eau Rouge and Radillon, we'll stay on board with the final setup, but then we might just do a quick look back at how they're driven with the other two setups. But ultimately we've gained a lot of speed through Eau Rouge and Radillon. Now we're on board in the car with our initial setup from Naz, and you can see that a lot of fighting a lot of oversteer here. Lots of tweaks, lots of corrections need to be made, and every time that happens there's a lift off the throttle. And now finally we'll go through with the car on the defaults. Now a bit of trouble getting the car turned in, but once it's been turned in, the rear is grippy, and so we can pin it from there on. Now I've synchronized the lap so that the cars are on the same bit of tarmac at the end of sector 1, because to do it normally where they start together, they're 4 seconds apart at the end, which isn't as much fun. So we're back on board now with the quickest setup, the actual Spa setup, and interesting to see how that a better run through Eau Rouge Radillon transfers to better speed all the way up the Kemmel Straight, which is slightly uphill by the way if ever you've been there in real life. Still see how the middle car is the oversteery car, the one that came to Spa with initial setting up from Nazareth, but it's twitchier than this one. It's oversteering on corner exit. We're getting into the apex beautifully here, but we're pulling away by the virtue of the fact that we can get back on the throttle a lot quicker. Go back to cockpit for a second. And pulling away massively through Pujon. We'll have a little look at the other cars through the next section, through Campus and Malmedy. So here's the final setup. It's coming in predictably in a balanced kind of way. We're able to get to an optimum turn in for the second corner, which is so important there. Let's compare. And now we're back in the oversteery car, the one that we arrived in from Nazareth. And you can just see how twitchy it is, the corrections that have got to be made, 2 or 3 corrections mid-corner, and every time you're doing that you're lifting off throttle, you're not putting power down. And we can see, and again we can see the exit there and the entry into Paul Frere, how we're just not as, this corner's okay, but we're just not as certain and as confident of being able to apply lock and apply throttle at the same time. And there it is, viewed from the default car, the slowest car. We can see the gap. And that is 4 seconds around Spa. Same car, same driver, same real road, same everything. The only difference is setup, and it's got us 4 seconds. So, bit of fun. You can tell what oversteer and understeer looks like. Bit of fun. Hope you enjoyed that.